Oh dear God, what is this guy claiming that we need to talk about now? Look, alright, look, just keep your head down and don't make any eye contact. There's a chance that he won't notice us. Hello there! Oh, for crying out loud, he's seen us. Yes, it's me again. Look, I'm sorry, alright? I even said so in some of the video titles. I know you've probably got things to do and people to see, but when football discourse rages, and you make the fatal error of providing me with a platform upon which to weigh in, and even monetize my hot takes, invariably, I'm afraid, that's what I'm going to do. In fact, in this instance, I'm not even doing so unprompted. I was in Prague on a hiatus from work when the FA announced the scrapping of all FA Cup replays, causing mild fury and a minor uproar in England, and consequently, lots of people to message me requesting a video about the decision and the drama that unfolded. For those of you outside of England, mild fury and a minor uproar is about as extreme as we get, at least since about the 17th century, so this was a pretty big deal. The FA Cup is the oldest tournament in world football, and domestically at least, arguably still the most prestigious. Founded in 1871, 17 years before the Football League, and 18 years before any country outside of Britain even founded a football association, the FA Cup was, until relatively recently, considered the biggest trophy in English football, and FA Cup Final Day the showpiece event in the English football calendar. The history of the FA Cup, in many ways, tells the history of English football as a whole. The first 10 FA Cups were dominated by ex-private schoolboys and elite universities, then it was wrestled from them by working class clubs in the Midlands and the Northwest, firstly through amateurism and eventually sanctioned professionalism, before football's popularity spread like wildfire, with everyone getting in on the act. In 1994, just 2 years after the breakaway of the Premier League from the Football League, leading to an avalanche of financialisation and commercialisation within English football, the FA Cup became sponsored for the first time by the football betting company Littlewoods. In the 30 years since the Premier League's breakaway from the Football League, just 9 different clubs have won the FA Cup, compared to 15 in the 30 years before that, reflecting the entrenched elitism and the erosion of competition in English football throughout that time. This season's final, between Manchester City and Manchester United, is a direct repeat of last year's final, and few would be surprised if the outcome of that game was the same as 12 months ago as well. Since 2015, the FA Cup has been sponsored by Emirates, the Emirati state-owned airline, and officially known as the Emirates FA Cup. In 1999, the FA Cup holders, Manchester United, withdrew from the competition in order to compete in the inaugural FIFA Club World Championship in Brazil, where they were knocked out in the group stage, finishing below Mexican side Necaxa and Brazilians Vasco da Gama. It was a decision which would have been perplexing and, quite simply, unthinkable at the start of the decade, but a quarter of a century on from it, the FA Cup has continued to be further and further watered down. Whereas teams used to rest players in the league for FA Cup ties, and see bumper crowds in the FA Cup compared to league fixtures, now the opposite is true. We shouldn't be surprised, therefore, by the latest nail that has been hammered into the FA Cup's coffin, but should we be angered, and indeed, should we care at all? Well, that's what today's video is all about. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to England and Wales, the only countries in the world with an entirely privatised water and sewage system, and where, unsurprisingly, the rivers and oceans now run brown with effluent, as we take a look at the latest FA Cup reforms, the backlash which has followed, and whether a better settlement is possible. For those of you who don't know, I should probably begin by briefly clarifying what is actually changing with regard to the FA Cup, and what the backlash has been. Fundamentally, the FA has announced 4 key changes. Firstly, all FA Cup replays from the first round onwards have been scrapped, meaning that if matches are still level after 90 minutes, they will go to extra time and penalties, rather than the away team hosting the home team in another fixture, in order to settle the tie. Secondly, the FA Cup final date has been moved, meaning that, for the first time, it will no longer be the season finale at the end of the English football calendar. That will instead be the final weekend of Premier League fixtures. Thirdly, the FA Cup has once again become a weekend competition, meaning that every round will take place on a weekend, rather than any midweek, with fewer clashes with the Premier League allowing for more games to be broadcast, and increased revenue for the FA as a result. And fourthly, last but not least, as part of the broader restructuring, which was agreed between the Premier League and the FA, the Premier League will now negotiate and sell the FA Cup's overseas media rights. The backlash came in hard and fast, a bit like a Robert Huth free kick. Over 100 different clubs put out statements opposing the changes, including most League 1 and 2 teams, a whole raft of non-league clubs, several in the Championship, and even one, Sheffield United, in the Premier League. Hey, they are still technically in the Premier League. For now. Don't be so rude. Just 7 clubs or managers throughout the entire pyramid, namely Arsenal, Man United, Wolves, Brentford, Norwich, Hull and Barnet, publicly released statements in favour of the reforms. The best statement, perhaps, came courtesy of Kidsgrove Athletic FC of the Northern Premier League Division 1 West, who tweeted, quote, "Kidsgrove Athletic stand in solidarity with the other 700 plus entrants of the FA Cup that weren't consulted over scrapping replays. We are disgusted that the greatest cup competition in the world is being killed to satisfy the wealthiest 3% of the football pyramid. Hashtag save the FA Cup." End quote. Accompanied by an AI-generated image of 2 young boys crying beside an FA Cup headstone, with half the cast of Peaky Blinders in the background. That prompted this copycat tweet, though I should probably point out that, unlike Kidsgrove Athletic, Streatham Rovers aren't a real football club. More significantly than the AI-generated mourners, if such a thing is possible, was the statement released by the EFL, who claimed that neither they nor their members, namely EFL clubs, had been consulted before the FA announcement was made, suggesting that it was basically a backroom deal that had been agreed between the FA and the Premier League behind the backs of the vast majority of teams who actually compete in the FA Cup. Aside from the lack of any consultation, the scrapping of replays in of themselves is controversial, particularly for clubs in League 1 and below, because FA Cup replays can be some of their biggest financial windfalls. The Premier League is the richest league in world football, by far, but outside of the top flight, virtually every football club in England is a loss-making operation. League 1 clubs as a whole, all 24 of them, generate less revenue than the likes of West Ham, Newcastle or Aston Villa on their own, and about the same amount as Fulham. League 1 clubs generate, on average, £9 million a season, League 2 clubs about £5 million, and, naturally, even less in the non-league game, and the further down the pyramid that you go. The average League 1 and 2 team also spends in excess of 100% of their revenue on wages alone, forgetting any other expenses, hence almost all run at either a small or, in some cases, a very significant loss. The FA Cup, therefore, whilst even winning the competition constitutes mere pocket change for the rich 6 in the Premier League, can present season or even era-defining opportunities to lower league clubs. In addition to the FA Cup's prize money in of itself, if a game is chosen for live television coverage by one of the broadcasters, that is worth at least £100,000, a monumental sum for lower league clubs, who are also likely to see a bumper crowd and increased gate receipts when they draw one of the big clubs. The biggest money spinner of all, though, which is why replays, before they were scrapped, were so coveted by the lower league clubs, is going away to one of the big boys. Whereas in the league, the home team keeps the gate receipts, which is why the top teams are so desperate to build new stadiums or expand their current ones, in the FA Cup, gate receipts are split 50-50 between the home and away team, minus any expenses. In the case of a trip to Manchester United, who generate around £4 million a game at home on average, that's likely to be worth between £1 to £2 million for a lower league club, with similar sums on offer for a trip to the Emirates, Anfield, Etihad, or Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. The dream scenario, then, as far as the chairman and accountants at lower league football clubs are concerned, was to be drawn against one of the top Premier League teams in the FA Cup at home, for the game to be televised, pocketing you in excess of £100,000, plus 50% of a bumper attendance, draw that game, earn a replay, which is highly likely to be televised after the shock of the first leg, and with less competition in the broadcasting slot for the replay, plus 50% of the gate receipts at a massive Premier League ground. For some clubs, that scenario, and those 2 games, could literally be worth 50% of their annual revenue. A mega cup run, in which you face 2 or 3 Premier League clubs, with 1 or 2 replays, would likely double a League 2 club's annual revenue. Burton Albion, back in January 2006, earned a third-round replay against Manchester United which, despite losing 5-0, was worth at least £800,000 to them. Burton used that money to repay a large part of the £7.2 million Pirelli Stadium that they had just moved into, and in no small part thanks to that windfall, they went on to win promotion to League One and eventually the Championship for the first time in the history of the club. A year earlier, it was Exeter City who drew Ferguson's men in the third round, also earning a replay. The 2 games were believed to be worth in excess of £1 million to the South Coast club, who had only recently won promotion from the non-league game, and a few years later, they too won promotion to League One. These aren't necessarily the fairy tale stories that make the FA Cup so iconic. Both Burton and Exeter were ultimately knocked out by the Red Devils, but economically, it was a vital lifeline for clubs operating on a shoestring budget, which provided a springboard for their success over the coming years. It is the scrapping of that windfall, and that opportunity, more so than the replays themselves or the romance of the club, without any consultation, that has angered EFL and non-league clubs. However, as has been pointed out by a few people at this point, these stories, like Exeter and Burton Albion, both almost 2 decades ago now, it feels relevant to point out, are few and far between. As The Athletic noted, only 12 League One and 2 teams have earned replays away at Premier League clubs in the last 10 seasons, and they lost every single one of them. Not since Shrewsbury Town earned a replay at Anfield in February 2020, over 4 years ago, has a team below the Championship travelled to a Premier League ground in an FA Cup replay. It is more common among Championship clubs, but there, the financial incentives aren't quite so extreme, especially for those in the race to win promotion to the Premier League. On the flip side, it should be said, Premier League and Championship teams only enter the FA Cup in the third round, and replays had already been scrapped from the 5th round onwards in previous seasons. The supposed big benefit, therefore, in terms of reducing the burden on the top teams for fixture congestion, is probably somewhat overblown. At the absolute most, if both their 3rd round and 4th round ties went to replays, which is itself fairly improbable, they would play 2 extra games, and if they both went to extra time, which is even less likely, they would play an additional 240 minutes of football. At a time when the Champions League is being expanded, the FIFA Club World Cup transformed into a serious competition, at least FIFA hopes, which would eat heavily into the calendar, and the top teams go on elaborate and taxing, yet lucrative tours of Asia, America and Australia, the scrapping of potential FA Cup replays, of which only one team actually competing in Europe, Aston Villa, even played in this season, is barely a drop in the ocean. As for the pre-season and indeed even end of season or in some cases mid-season tours, it's hard to see how the top Premier League teams, who complain incessantly about fixture congestion, sometimes quite legitimately, but are happy to add long-haul flights and 2, 3 or even 4 games to their schedule if the price is right, can have a leg to stand on or dodge accusations of latent hypocrisy. Fundamentally, however, the problem that lower league clubs face, and their grievance with the scrapping of FA Cup replays, is a financial rather than a sporting one, and given how rare FA Cup replays against Premier League teams are for lower league clubs, it clearly isn't a sustainable business model for clubs to be relying on, at best, probably a once-in-a-decade event in order to plug a hole in their finances for the next season or 2 at most. In theory, scrapping replay should actually benefit the smaller clubs. It is much easier to hang on for 90 or 120 minutes against a far superior team and win on penalties than it is to win over 2 games where, typically, the quality, depth and athleticism of a Premier League team invariably shines through. That's why you always get more upsets in single-leg knockout competitions than you do in 2-legged ones. People talk about tradition a lot in football, and rightly so in some instances, but lower league teams relying on the vanishingly unlikely prospect of making it through to the 3rd round of the FA Cup, drawing a Premier League team, and earning a replay once in a blue moon to stop them from going bust, isn't some kind of age-old tradition in English football, it's just a bleak reflection of where the game has gone since the creation of the Premier League. When Hereford United beat Newcastle United 2-1 in the third round of the FA Cup in 1972, in probably the single most famous FA Cup replay upset of all time, it wasn't celebrated because it would fund Hereford for the next 5 years and stop them from going out of business. There was a financial benefit, of course, which would have been warmly welcomed by the club at the time, no doubt, but principally, it was a celebration of sporting achievement, the triumph of the underdog, and the prospect of playing another big club, West Ham in Hereford's case, in the next round. The idea that it would be better to earn a replay against Liverpool or Man United for a lower league or non-league team, and then to get thrashed at Anfield or Old Trafford due to the financial incentives involved, that it would be just to beat them, is actually a remarkably recent phenomenon, and I still don't think that it's one that's shared by most football fans. Nigel Clough, who was the Burton Albion manager when they took Manchester United to a replay at Old Trafford, said in an interview that when Burton had a chance to win the game to the death at home and progress through to the fourth round, his chairman was the only home fan in the stadium praying that their striker would miss. Now, maybe Clough was just being hyperbolic, or maybe he was telling the God's honest truth. But the fact of that even being a consideration, that it might be better to draw a game against a giant and lose the second leg than to actually win the first and knock them out, is a totally perverse incentive structure which undermines the very nature of sporting competition and, quite frankly therefore, should never exist. It is a more extreme version of, anecdotally, the phenomenon of younger football fans supposedly valuing finishing in the top four over winning any cup competition other than the Champions League, which, obviously, also carries with it automatic qualification for next season's Champions League. When my own team, Hull City, qualified for the Europa League by reaching the FA Cup final in 2014, as I've mentioned on this channel in the past, our then manager, Steve Bruce, rested players in qualifying against Belgian side Lokeren ahead of a Premier League game against Stoke, which led to us getting knocked out. Now, Steve Bruce was an employee of Hull City, a business, and his boss, the Alams, would have been far more concerned about survival and retaining Premier League revenue than a cup run, hence the decision to essentially forego a once-in-a-lifetime European campaign and potential trips to the San Siro or Stadio Olimpico in order to get a 1-1 draw against Stoke. In the end, we were knocked out of the Europa League and got relegated. So, you know, all's well that ends well. I can almost forgive Steve Bruce's thinking though. In a professional capacity, he is doing a job and looking to increase shareholder returns, as perverse as that may be. But the idea of that way of thinking seeping into the minds of football fans is enough to make me feel a little bit ill. If the problem is a financial, rather than a sporting one, in terms of the opposition of lower league teams to scrapping FA Cup replays, which I think we can safely say that we have established it is, then it seems clear to me at least that the solution ought to be a financial rather than a sporting one as well. There have been lots of suggestions as to how the economic problem of scrapping FA Cup replays could be solved. The FA claim, having had to issue their own statement in response to all of the statements by EFL and non-league clubs slagging them off, that the dedicated weekends, increase in the number of televised games, and having the Premier League negotiate and distribute their overseas television rights will lead to a substantial increase in revenue generated by the FA Cup, which already accounts for 60% of the FA's total revenue, which can then be evenly distributed throughout the pyramid, benefiting all clubs, not just the few that managed to earn FA Cup replays against Premier League teams in the past. In theory, it sounds great. A fairer and more sustainable solution to the financial difficulties facing lower league clubs. In reality, the increase in revenue is likely to be a pittance, plus the token £33 million thrown in by the Premier League, which, when distributed throughout the EFL, non-league and grassroots game, which the £33 million is earmarked for, will be little more than a drop in the ocean. It's worth noting that the EFL don't claim never to have been consulted about the scrapping of FA Cup replays. They make it clear that talks between themselves, the FA and the Premier League, previously took place, in which they were willing to entertain the idea in exchange for a long-rumoured and much-discussed, more generous and transformative redistribution by the Premier League throughout the Football League pyramid. The FA also alluded to those discussions in their statement, but what they've done is greenlight the reforms that the EFL said that they were theoretically willing to entertain without actually consulting the EFL on the final decision, and without providing the transformative package that the EFL requested in exchange for the reforms. Hence the irritation at the EFL. Other suggestions have been made though. One is that both teams get to say before the tie whether they would like a replay or not, and if either of them or both of them say that they would, there has to be a replay if the game ends in a draw, so lower league clubs could safeguard their financial windfall, but divisional rivals, whether that be two Premier League teams or indeed two League Two teams who wouldn't actually stand to gain meaningfully from playing each other once again, could just agree to settle the tie over 90 or possibly 120 minutes and penalties. Personally, I am uncomfortable with having a cup competition where the rules are different for some clubs than others, even if both teams have voted in favour of it. I know, I feel a bit like this meme, but in a sporting context. This might not be a popular opinion, but to protect the integrity of a competition, the oldest and one of the most prestigious competitions in all of world football no less, I think that the rules have to be the same and the playing field equal for all teams. For the same reason, I don't like it when VAR is used in competitions when the game is at a Premier League ground, because the technology is already in place, but not at lower league stadiums. To my mind, the rules should be the same for every team, at every ground, in every round. Maybe I sound full boomer at this stage, but I think there is something to what I'm saying. Would we be happy for teams in the World Cup to say, before a game, that they were both happy for there to be no extra time or penalties, and for the game to be decided by a coin toss, as was unironically once the case, or for teams in the Champions League to be able to vote on whether they wanted knockout games to be played over one or two legs, or even for some teams to have VAR and others to not? I don't think that we would, and I don't think that the FA Cup should be any different. In the Copa del Rey, Spain's equivalent of the FA Cup, the draw for each round has been seeded since 2019, ensuring that lower league teams are always drawn at home against La Liga teams until all lower league teams have been eliminated. Gary Neville recently expressed support for something similar to be implemented in the FA Cup. Meanwhile, Jamie Carragher has advocated that lower league clubs should always be allowed to determine whether they play at home or away when drawn against Premier League teams. Again, this is a solution of sorts, in the sense that it would provide an infrequent economic boost to some lower league clubs, but it is a very inelegant one. Surely, to me at least, one of the great joys of the FA Cup has always been the total randomness of the draw. Sure, being drawn away at Wigan 3 seasons in a row is enough to make you want to gouge your own eyes out. No offence, Wigan fans, it just gets a bit sameish after a while. But the unpredictability of two big boys meeting in the third round, or each getting drawn away at a League 2 club, is all part of the magic. Also, if you seed the draws, even if this is only a secondary, unintended consequence, you are making it much more likely that lower league teams won't progress because they'll get such difficult draws from the third round onwards, and the Premier League teams will become even more dominant than they already are in the latter stages. Coventry, who reached the FA Cup semi-final this season and put up such a great showing and comeback against Manchester United, only actually faced one other Premier League team, Wolves, en route to the final, overcoming Oxford United, Sheffield Wednesday, and Maidstone United in the other rounds. That is not to diminish their run. My club, Hull City, had a similarly easy run all the way to the final in 2014, if you want to put it like that. I'm just saying that if they had faced another Premier League team in the fourth round, it would obviously have been more difficult for Coventry to have made it through to the semis. So, basically, what I'm saying, the point that I'm trying to get at, the gist of it, broadly speaking, is that I don't like any of the suggestions. I think that they're all rubbish, and none of them address the bigger picture or the systemic failings which face English football. The Premier League is an all-conquering and all-consuming juggernaut. It is a league without peer in all of world football at this stage, with higher revenue than the next two biggest leagues, La Liga and the Bundesliga combined, and with that gap only growing ever wider every time that the league's domestic and international broadcast rates are renegotiated. In truth, the domestic rates have pretty much peaked at this stage. Domestic customers have been milked for all that they've got, but the global audience is still showing significant growth. In theory, those two words again, this should be great for the English game, having an extremely lucrative behemoth at the head of it, and in some ways it is. In others, however, it is an extremely malignant force. I said in my most recent video about Eritrea that whereas most countries have armies, Eritrea is an army which has a country, and, hear me out, in some ways, it is a similar story with the Premier League. Whereas almost all other countries, whether that be Spain, Italy or France, have top flights, which are tied to at least the division below them, like the Bundesliga and Second Bundesliga, or to the entire professional pyramid, and are run as a collective by, for instance, the Ligue de Football Professionnel in France, which comes under the authority of the French Football Federation. The Premier League, which isn't tied to any other leagues, administratively, I mean, that was basically its entire founding principle, operates almost entirely independent of the Football Association, and is both much richer and much more powerful than the governing body which, theoretically, ought to be tasked with overseeing it. In that sense, England isn't a country with a top flight, which just so happens to be the Premier League, but rather, the Premier League is a league which has a country, which just so happens to be England. If power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely, then we ought not be surprised that the almost entirely unaccountable Premier League has become a great corrupting influence upon the English game. The most recent reforms to the FA Cup are relatively small fry within the context of an ongoing power grab by the game's elite, which has only accelerated in this country since the government announced the creation of an independent regulator to try and wrestle some of that power away from the teams at the top and ensure better governance throughout the game. Statesmen and women have long held on to the old adage that nations have no such thing as friends or enemies, only interests, and in the 21st century, football clubs are no different. Pep Guardiola even invoked that very quote, probably erroneously crediting it to Julius Caesar, in response to the 115 charges levelled against Manchester City over a year ago. We hear a lot at the moment about the Big Six or Rich Six cartel, particularly from fans of the other 14 Premier League clubs, and especially those, like Newcastle and Aston Villa, who feel as though the current PSR and FFP regulations prevent them from being able to challenge the elite. Newcastle, it should just be said, voted in favour of the introduction of PSR under their previous ownership regime, whilst Manchester City did not. So the narrative can be a little bit dubious at times, as I covered in a recent video specifically about FFP and PSR. Nonetheless, it is true that the Rich Six have close ties and communication, as we saw with Project Big Picture in the European Super League proposals, and collectively seek to act in their own interests. But at the same time, the other 14 Premier League teams, or a strong majority of them at least, fight to safeguard parachute payments, which give recently relegated Premier League teams an enormous advantage over the rest of the Championship, which makes it extremely difficult for those 21 teams to compete with the 3 relegated clubs, because if they were to be relegated, they want to hold on to that advantage. Championship clubs themselves, meanwhile, moan about redistribution, again, quite legitimately, but the top-end ones in particular, including my own club, were lukewarm at best in their support of FA Cup replays, in case they themselves get promoted. The list goes on, and there is no one there, at any stage practically, who has the interests of English football as a whole at heart, rather than just one small constituent of it for self-interested reasons. In some ways, the FA Cup reforms are more of a palate cleanser for English football, a continuation of the gradual erosion of the emotional fabric of the game, setting the stage for much more radical changes still to come, as has been proposed, but knocked back in the past. Anyone who thinks that the Super League proposals, in some way, shape or form, are dead and buried, for example, I suspect is in for a rude awakening. Unlike the FA, FIFA and UEFA do still wield some power, and have effectively lobbied most European leagues other than the Premier League, though it is dubious as to whether that is a good thing. UEFA and FIFA want 18 team top flights, and only 1 domestic cup competition, clearing room in the calendar for their own competitions. Ligue 1 switched from being a 20 to an 18-team league this season. Meanwhile, secondary domestic cup competitions, like the Coupe de la Ligue in France and the DFL Liga Pokal in Germany, were scrapped in 2020 and 2007. English football has so far resisted those changes. The Premier League is still a 20-team league, down from 22 teams ever since the 1995-96 season, and the EFL Cup is now the last remaining secondary cup competition involving teams in any of Europe's Big Five leagues. There is indeed an even bigger picture to all of this than just football. Britain is now almost 50 years into an experiment in selling off almost all social goods to the highest bidder, in the belief that whether they are an aristocrat, oligarch, or indeed a foreign state, those with the deepest pockets are always best qualified to run those industries. The end result is rivers and seas which are flowing with sewage, schools which are literally crumbling, unaffordable energy and utility bills, rent and house prices, real wages which aren't just stagnant but have actually declined in real terms over the last 15 years, over 4 million children living in poverty, and just about the worst, yet still somehow the most expensive, public transport in all of Western Europe, at least outside of London. By comparison then, selling football off to the highest bidder has been a roaring success. The Premier League is one of the UK's few genuine growth industries and global brands. But as with everything else, it has resulted in a few people, or clubs, becoming extraordinarily wealthy and powerful, and everyone else, or every other club, becoming penniless, powerless, and enduring a precarious existence. Sure, it's sad about Bury, Oldham, Aldershot, Scunthorpe, Southend, Yeovil, Rochdale, Chesterfield, York, Torquay, Hereford, Darlington and Macclesfield, but there were 14 Premier League clubs in last season's top 30 of the Deloitte Football Money League. Soon, it's predicted, all 20 Premier League clubs will be in there. Manchester City could soon eclipse $1 billion in annual revenue. Spurs make more than £100 million a season in matchday revenue alone since moving into their new £1 billion stadium. The Glazers are at least $5 billion richer thanks to their acquisition and ownership of Manchester United. Honestly, I do wish that people would at least consider the positives sometimes. Tottenham's expensive new stadium, where season tickets range from £856 to £2,147, is very lucrative, and Manchester United have helped make the Glazers the 44th richest family in America, allowing them to live a life of unimaginable luxury without actually ever having to do anything. So, you know, every cloud and all that. Don't tell me that you're still thinking about Bury and Aldershot. So the Premier League juggernaut will keep rolling on, throwing crumbs in the direction of a crumbling EFL non-league and grassroots game. The imbalance of power will become more and more firmly entrenched, and Britain's rivers, overflowing as they are with effluent, will continue to run an ever deeper shade of brown. On that note, that is it for today's video, which critics are already describing as unusually positive and upbeat. In fact, if you are really annoyed about the scrapping of FA Cup replays and the final being moved to inside the season, the latter of which I actually think is worse, you should direct your anger at this man. That's right, William Arthur Philip Louise Mountbatten Windsor, aka the Prince of Pegging, allegedly, and the future King of the United Kingdom. After all, Prince William is the president of the Football Association and has been for the last 18 years. Yes, I know, he got the job when he was only 23 years old. A remarkable early achiever, if ever I've seen one. A modern-day Mozart, if you will. A bit like the equally gifted and honourable Prince Andrew, another child prodigy who occupied the role before him, and of course, who could forget the great Prince Edward who preceded him. Huge fan of football was old Ed, he stuck around from 1971 to 2000. As the head of the FA, especially for such a long period of time, surely the buck has to stop with Will. You had a good innings, son, after earning the job fair and square, no doubt, but maybe it is time to pass on the baton to someone with the skill, intellect and experience required to properly hold the Premier League's feet to the fire and govern the English game. Personally, I would like to throw Lady Louise Windsor's name into the hat. I don't think that she's doing much at the moment, and now that she's turned 20, it's about time that we put her to work. Or alternatively, why not give it to Lady Margarita Armstrong-Jones until the end of the season, who, as I understand it, has already gained invaluable experience in business by founding a bespoke jewellery brand based in Paris, but, you know, I am open to suggestions. Right, little bit of silliness out of the way to take the edge off a bleak video done and dusted. That really is it for today's video. Thank you all very much, as ever, for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. I hope that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. And of course, it goes without saying at this stage, make sure that you are subscribed not just to this channel, HITC Sevens, but also my second channel, Alfie Potts Harmer, both of which should be about to appear on your screens now. This channel just hit 600,000 subscribers, it should be said, so thanks for that. I'm trying to get the other one to 25,000, so if you can help out with that. Cheers. And of course, you can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, or Threads via the username @HITC Sevens on all three. And all of those good things, plus a whole lot more, should be down in the video description below. Cheers.